Picture this. It's 1962, and a highly educated German rocket scientist named Heinz Krug walks into a super dense, totally isolated Munich forest.
Right, and he was absolutely terrified.
Oh, completely. For months, he'd been getting these anonymous threats about his work on a covert missile program for the Egyptian government.
Yeah, so desperate, Krug actually reaches out to the one guy he thinks can protect him.
Which is wild. He reaches out to a guy he views as this legendary hero of the Third Reich, Hitler's top SS commando, Otto Skorzeny.
Exactly. So Krug follows Skorzeny into the tree line, completely unaware of two pretty critical facts.
First, his supposed protector was actually on the covert payroll of the Jewish state.
Right. And second, he was never going to walk out of that forest.
It's mind-blowing. Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a historical record today that fundamentally challenges everything we understand about justice and statecraft.
Yeah, we're examining an era defined by alliances so contradictory they honestly border on the surreal.
Right. So the mission of this deep dive is to deconstruct this staggering documented reality. We're looking at Western intelligence agencies and Israel's Mossad systematically recruiting, protecting, and weaponizing former Gestapo and SS officers right after World War II.
And just to set some ground rules here, we are not here to endorse any political framework or pass retroactive moral judgment.
No, definitely not. We are just impartially examining the bizarre actual historical record.
Exactly, because to understand the mechanics of this amoral pragmatism, we really have to isolate the extreme edge cases.
Which brings us right back to the guy in the Munich forest, Otto Skorzeny.
Right, an unrepentant SS officer, a guy who built his reputation executing the absolute most audacious operations for the Nazi regime.
And then transitions seamlessly into a hired assassin for the very people his former government tried to annihilate.
It defies standard logic, it really does.
It's nuts. But before we get into the assassinations and the forged documents, we need to establish the baseline for this guy. Why did the world view him the way it did?
Well, to comprehend Skorzeny's perceived value, you have to look at the operation that really catapulted him into international mythology.
You mean Operation Aish, the Gran Sasso raid in September 1943?
Yeah, exactly. This wasn't just a military victory. It was this massive psychological weapon forged through highly unconventional logistics.
Right, because at that point in the war, Benito Mussolini had been deposed and arrested by the Italian government.
And they were looking to negotiate an armistice with the Allies, so they had to hide him.
And they didn't just put him in some jail cell. They put him at the Hotel Campo Imperatore,
which is a ski resort on a highly fortified mountain plateau in the Abruzzo Mountains, the Gran Sasso Massif.
Geographically, it's literally a fortress.
Yeah, we are talking an elevation of over 6,500 feet. The terrain itself is the primary defense mechanism.
Because a conventional military assault is just physically impossible up there, right?
Right. An armored column or an infantry division trying to go up a single mountain road, they'd be systematically dismantled by Italian anti-aircraft guns.
So Hitler tasks Skorzeny with extracting Mussolini. And if you can't go up the mountain, you have to come from above.
But a standard parachute drop is equally suicidal.
Oh, for sure. The air at that altitude is way too thin for 1940s parachutes. Plus, the drop zone is just jagged rock.
Yeah, paratroopers would just be target practice on the way down.
So what does Skorzeny do?
This is where his specific brand of operational audacity comes in. He realizes the only way to breach it is through a sudden, silent introduction of a specialized force.
Gliders. He uses DFS 230 gliders.
Right. Lightweight, stealthy aircraft with absolutely no engines. They can carry a pilot and 9 fully equipped troops.
Which is insane to wrap your head around. The mechanical precision required is just astounding.
Oh, absolutely. You're towing these unpowered gliders behind bomber aircraft, releasing them at this exact mathematical moment in the sky.
And just expecting the pilots to silently ride thermal currents over the mountains and crash land onto a tiny, boulder-strewn patch of rock.
Right outside the hotel doors. It was an assault that relied entirely on psychological paralysis.
Because when you introduce an impossible variable like gliders silently crashing onto a mountain peak, the defense network just freezes.
Exactly. The Italian guards were so completely overwhelmed by the sheer audacity of it that Skorzeny and his commandos breached the hotel without firing a single shot.
They just walked in and took Mussolini. And it earns him the Knight's Cross directly from Hitler.
He becomes the ultimate poster boy for the regime's military propaganda.
But what I find truly revealing is Skorzeny's perspective on this decades later in his memoir.
A Commando Operations, right?
Yeah. He isn't basking in the cinematic glory of it. He's actually intensely bitter about how the film adaptations portrayed it.
He called one specific film recreation mediocre in every respect, I believe.
What's fascinating here is the psychological disconnect between the architect of the operation and the audience consuming its history.
Well, Skorzeny was an engineer by training. He viewed Gran Sasso as this triumph of mathematics and atmospheric analysis.
Right, he spent months calculating glide ratios and weather patterns.
But the public just wants the swashbuckling action hero. They want the dramatic crash landing.
So why do we do that? Why does the historical narrative consistently strip away the granular mechanics for the myth?
Because the granular mechanics force you to reckon with the reality of the people doing the math.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. When society romanticizes the tactical brilliance, smoothing over the brutal realities into an action sequence, it creates a psychological distance.
You focus on the how, so you don't have to look at the why.
Exactly. And the why here was preserving a fascist dictator to prolong a catastrophic global conflict. Stripping away the context sanitizes the operator.
It turns a highly efficient cog in an evil machine into, like, a standalone anti-hero.
And that exact same mechanism is how Skorzeny navigated the immediate post-war period.
Right, because after the Third Reich collapses, he's captured by the U.S. military and held at the Darmstadt internment camp in 1948.
And if you rely on that cinematic mythos, you'd expect his escape to be some feat of physical endurance.
Scaling fences under machine gun fire or tunneling out?
But the reality is far more indicative of how intelligence operations actually function. It was a masterclass in social engineering.
It's literally like a heist movie. Like Catch Me If You Can or Ocean's 11. He didn't break out. He just walked out the front gates.
Right. 3 of his former SS associates just acquired fake U.S. military police uniforms.
They sourced American military jeeps, drove right up to the heavily guarded front gate of an American internment facility in broad daylight.
And this mechanism relied entirely on authority bias.
Because in 1948, the infrastructure in Germany was so fractured.
Totally overwhelmed by displaced persons, POWs, shifting jurisdictions. In that environment, the appearance of authority is practically actual authority.
They literally walked up, handed over a clipboard with forged transfer papers, and said they had orders to move Otto Skorzeny.
And the guards, conditioned to obey the uniform and the paperwork, just complied.
They handed over one of the highest-profile Nazi prisoners because someone showed up in a jeep with a clipboard.
It really highlights a critical vulnerability in any massive security apparatus.
So they drive out into the Bavarian countryside. He spends 18 months on a farm, then heads to Paris, and eventually sets up in fascist Spain under Franco.
So we have this guy who knows exactly how to exploit systemic chaos, understands psychological leverage, and has no ideological home left.
The ultimate mercenary.
Exactly. But how does a fugitive hiding in Bavaria become a contracted asset for the State of Israel?
That requires a profound ideological inversion on the part of Mossad.
To understand that bridge, we have to look at Mossad's foundational architecture in the post-war era.
Formed in 1949, right?
Yeah. And their mandate was radically different from agencies like the CIA or MI6. They weren't just a geopolitical censor network.
No, they were an intelligence apparatus built directly on the psychological trauma of the Holocaust.
Their primary mission was the immediate physical survival of a highly vulnerable nascent state.
But also, totally woven into that was the pursuit of retributive justice.
Right, they were the operational arm of a people who just endured an industrial genocide. That requires proactive, aggressive defense.
Like Operation Finale in 1960, tracking and abducting Adolf Eichmann from Buenos Aires.
Exactly. They didn't just assassinate him in the street. They invested massive resources to smuggle him out of Argentina to stand trial in Jerusalem.
It was this highly visible demonstration of accountability. They put the logistics officer of the final solution in a glass booth and broadcast it to the world.
It defined Mossad's moral baseline, which makes the events of 1962 so structurally jarring.
Right, because just 2 years after Eichmann, Israel faces this terrifying new variable, Operation Damocles.
The Egyptian missile program. German aerospace scientists were secretly contracting their expertise to Egypt.
And we have to be clear why this was an existential crisis. A missile program completely alters the strategic geometry of the Middle East.
Yeah, you can track aircraft on radar, but ballistic rockets, the early warning window shrinks to minutes.
And Israeli intelligence was terrified these rockets could carry chemical or radioactive warheads.
From their perspective, they were staring down a potential second Holocaust, engineered by the same minds that built V-2 rockets for Hitler.
So the mandate is clear. Dismantle the Egyptian program by any means necessary. You have to remove the human capital. Convince the German scientists to walk away.
And this is where we see the transition from moral absolutism to extreme pragmatism.
Because Mossad assesses the psychological profile of these targets.
Right. If an Israeli agent threatens a German scientist, it might work, but it also reinforces geopolitical boundaries. It's an external threat.
But Mossad had the LAP department, the Lahama psychologist.
Their entire operational focus was psychological warfare.
And they realized the best way to break a German scientist isn't to threaten them from the outside, but to terrify them from the inside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you want to induce absolute paralysis, you deploy the bogeyman of their own defunct regime. You weaponize the legend of the SS.
They realized Skorzeny wasn't just a man. He was a highly valuable brand of ruthlessness.
And they didn't try to convert him ideologically. They didn't ask him to swear loyalty to Israel.
It was purely transactional. They hired him as an independent contractor.
The compartmentalization here is essential. Mossad maintained a strict firewall. Skorzeny wasn't briefed on broader strategy.
He was just given specific, localized objectives. His primary utility was his signature.
Right. If a scientist got a warning letter backed by Otto Skorzeny, the psychological impact was devastating.
It tells them this isn't just espionage. This is the ultimate enforcer of your former world, and he will dismantle your life.
But the LAP department didn't stop at letter writing. It escalated to physical execution.
Right. Which brings us back to the Heinz Krug assassination.
Krug represents the fatal intersection of psychological terror and historical irony. He was procuring hardware for the Egyptian program.
And the intimidation campaign was working. He was panicked, constantly looking over his shoulder.
But the psychological profile dictates his reaction. When terrified, people retreat to familiar structures of authority.
Didn't go to the West German police.
Probably because his work existed in a legally gray area or he just didn't trust them.
Instead, he seeks out the ultimate apex predator of his own cultural paradigm, Otto Skorzeny.
Krug operates under the fatal assumption that ideological loyalty is permanent. He thinks Skorzeny will protect a fellow German scientist.
He literally volunteers to walk into the snare. He arranges a meeting in Munich to discuss security protocols.
And Skorzeny, acting on direct instructions from Mossad, agrees. He drives Krug out of the city, deep into the Bavarian forest.
And the execution is brutally efficient.
Skorzeny simply draws a firearm and executes him. No interrogation, no dramatic confrontation.
Swift liquidation. And immediately after, a Mossad extraction team arrives.
They don't even just bury the body. They utilize chemical disposal.
They dissolve Heinz Krug's remains in acid to ensure no forensic evidence is ever found. He just vanishes.
When you analyze the mechanics of this event, it is a staggering demonstration of statecraft superseding ideology.
But I have to ask, how does an institution compartmentalize this level of contradiction?
It's the central friction of intelligence ethics.
I mean, you put Eichmann on trial to demonstrate the triumph of law over barbarism, and 24 months later, you're paying an SS commando to melt a man in acid in a forest. Doesn't the agency sacrifice its moral charter?
Well, from the perspective of the Mossad Directorate, morality is a hierarchy, and the apex is the survival of the State of Israel.
So everything else is subordinate to that survival.
Exactly. They didn't view hiring Skorzeny as a moral collapse. They viewed it as the ultimate triumph of utility. They were forcing the enemy's machinery to protect their future.
But the operational risk is astronomical. If the press finds out Israel is funding Hitler's favorite commando, the diplomatic fallout would be devastating.
Government collapsing, easily.
So how did they secure his loyalty? You can't just hand Skorzeny a briefcase of cash.
Right, because he was already independently wealthy from post-war business ventures. Financial compensation wasn't leverage.
They needed a currency he actually valued.
And the only thing a globally recognized fugitive truly values is freedom of movement, psychological security.
He wanted his name taken off the hit list, maintained by Simon Wiesenthal.
Simon Wiesenthal was the embodiment of relentless, unofficial justice, a Holocaust survivor who dedicated his life to tracking Nazi war criminals.
Being on his radar meant living in permanent hypervigilance.
Every time Skorzeny started his car or opened mail, there was a chance it was rigged to explode.
So Skorzeny tells his Israeli handlers, "I'll dismantle the Egyptian program, but the price is absolute amnesty. Get Wiesenthal to clear my name."
Mossad agrees and dispatches operatives to negotiate with Wiesenthal.
And Wiesenthal's response is a fascinating contrast in ethics. He flatly refuses.
Right. For him, justice is not a commodity to be traded for tactical advantage. He's a witness to genocide, not an intelligence officer optimizing a threat matrix.
Dropping a senior SS officer from his list would invalidate his entire life's work.
So Weisenthal's refusal creates a massive operational bottleneck for Mossad. They have the perfect weapon, but the safety is jammed by moral absolutism.
So what do? They pivot to absolute deception. Here's where it gets really interesting. Mossad's forgery department produces a counterfeit pardon document.
The mechanics of forging a document like this in 1962 are highly complex.
You can't just type it up on any paper.
No, they had to source the exact vintage of paper, analyze the specific mechanical imperfections of Weisenthal's typewriter, and execute a flawless signature reproduction.
And they had to understand Skorzeny's psychological vulnerability. He was a paranoid operative, he'd scrutinize it.
But Mossad gambled that his intense desire for the document to be real would override his critical analysis.
And it worked. They presented the forged letter, and he accepted it.
It's a masterclass in asymmetrical leverage. They manipulated their most dangerous asset by hijacking the moral authority of a man who despised him.
It's a total subversion of reality, an unrepentant Nazi executing another Nazi for Israel under the false belief that a Jewish survivor absolved him.
The layers of manipulation are so dense that objective truth basically ceases to exist.
It perfectly illustrates how human emotion, like the desire for absolution, is just another vector to be exploited in covert ops.
Absolutely. But Skorzeny's value wasn't limited to his clandestine work for Mossad.
Right, because while he's running these black ops for Israel, he's simultaneously building a sprawling multinational infrastructure.
Let's look at his business model in Spain. In 1970, under Franco's protection, he co-founds the Paladin Group.
Which is basically the prototype for the modern private military corporation.
Exactly. Before corporate security contractors were common, Skorzeny saw a massive market inefficiency.
All these right-wing authoritarian regimes and dictators who needed elite security forces but didn't know how to train them.
So Skorzeny effectively franchises the tactical methodologies of the SS.
If a South American junta needs a counterinsurgency unit, they just contract the Paladin Group.
Built on total deniability, operating outside international law, providing instruction in psychological warfare and internal suppression.
And his network was genuinely global. Look at his connections to Argentina.
Juan Perón's Argentina was the premier sanctuary for European fascists.
But Skorzeny's experience wasn't the standard fugitive narrative. He didn't hide in a remote village.
No, he was absorbed directly into the highest echelons of the elite. He worked as a personal bodyguard and security consultant for Eva Perón.
Evita. It's a striking visual, right? This towering former SS commando acting as the physical shield for one of Latin America's most iconic figures.
It demonstrates his profound ability to identify centers of power and make himself indispensable.
But honestly, the most jarring geographic anomaly for me is his time in Ireland.
Oh, the Martinstown House estate.
Yes. In 1959, he executes a real estate transaction that completely shatters the dark operative narrative. He buys a 160-acre estate in County Kildare.
Ireland had remained neutral during World War II, so they maintained a certain detachment from pursuing war criminals.
But he doesn't even use a front company. A globally recognized SS officer with a highly distinctive facial scar just buys a massive farm and lives openly.
Driving high-end Mercedes around the Irish countryside.
Socializing with Dublin elite. It's wild.
It highlights the extreme unevenness of post-war accountability. In Munich, he's melting bodies in acid. In Buenos Aires, he's a shadow in the halls of power.
And in County Kildare, he's a celebrity gentleman farmer.
He successfully compartmentalized his life across different global jurisdictions.
But all of this, the Paladin Group, Argentina, Ireland, is totally eclipsed by his involvement in Die Spinne, the spider.
Which makes Mossad's decision to hire him almost incomprehensible.
Exactly. While managing his global profile, Skorzeny was the primary architect of this advanced rat line network.
Die Spinne was highly organized and deeply funded, engineered specifically to extract former SS members from Europe.
Shielding them from Allied tribunals and Israeli intelligence.
He utilized his wealth in Spain to fund the operational hubs, exploiting transit routes through Italy.
They manipulated the chaotic refugee system, secured forged Red Cross passports.
Corrupt border officials, safe houses. They systematically funneled an estimated 600 former SS members out of Europe to South America and the Middle East.
I have to highlight the systemic irony here. Mossad's entire foundational charter is hunting down perpetrators of the Holocaust.
Right.
And for Operation Damocles, They select a contractor who is the literal mastermind who constructed the escape infrastructure for their primary targets.
It really forces us to reevaluate the baseline logic of intelligence operations.
They had to know who he was and what Spinne was doing.
They absolutely knew.
Yeah.
But they calculated that his self-interest was a stronger mechanism than ideological loyalty.
They trusted the leverage of the forged pardon more than they feared his connection to the rat lines.
Total optimization of resources, entirely devoid of moral consideration.
But if Mossad's tactical alliance with one SS officer seems extreme, we really have to pull the camera back.
Right, because the United States and Great Britain engaged in the wholesale ingestion of the Nazi intelligence apparatus.
Industrial-scale integration of Nazi personnel during this exact same window.
And the catalyst for this monumental shift was the rapid onset of the Cold War.
The moment the surrender documents are signed, the map changes. The U.S. and Britain realize the Red Army controls half of Europe.
The threat of Soviet communism becomes the singular focus of Western foreign policy.
They need intelligence on the Soviets immediately, and they have basically zero assets on the ground in Eastern Europe.
So the mechanism of pragmatism kicks in. They realize the only demographic with extensive experience running intelligence against the Soviets is the defeated German military.
They just decide to recycle the enemy. Which brings us to the Gehlen Organization.
Major General Reinhard Gehlen was the head of Foreign Armies East. The German intelligence directorate focused on the Soviet Union.
And as the Third Reich collapsed, Gehlen knew his market value.
He buried his extensive archives in the Bavarian Alps, surrendered to the Americans, and offered his files in exchange for protection.
And the U.S. Army just absorbs him, but it accelerates dramatically when the CIA is formed in 1947.
The CIA basically purchases his entire operation. They start funding his network with a staggering $175,000 monthly stipend.
And declassified documents confirm that this network was staffed by hundreds of former SS and SD officers.
The Internal Security and Intelligence Service of the SS.
How does an American agency structurally justify putting hundreds of SS officers on the payroll? You'd assume there was a rigid vetting process.
The vetting process was a deliberate failure. By 1951, the CIA essentially dismantled its own internal security protocols regarding Gehlen's network.
They outsourced the vetting to Gehlen himself.
Because their desperation for anti-Soviet intelligence created this massive ideological blind spot. They assumed any enemy of communism was an acceptable ally.
Let's look at the specific individuals who slipped through. Otto von Bolschwing.
Right. He wasn't a battlefield commander. His expertise was bureaucratic terror.
An S-brigadier who specialized in the architecture of persecution.
He developed the bureaucratic mechanisms to systematically expropriate Jewish property and wealth in Austria.
He designed the financial blueprint for genocide. And later, he was instrumental in inciting a massive, brutal pogrom in Bucharest.
Yet the CIA recruits him specifically for his knowledge of Eastern European political networks.
And they actively lobby the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service to bypass security restrictions so he can live comfortably in California.
The willingness to bypass constraints extended to even more senior figures like Erich Rogakovich in 1959.
Adolf Eichmann's direct representative in the Netherlands.
Rogakovich personally managed the logistical nightmare of deporting Dutch Jews to extermination centers.
The CIA literally reaches out to the guy who managed the train schedules for the final solution and offers him a job.
He ultimately declined, but extending the offer proves there was absolutely no moral floor.
Your past didn't matter if you could theoretically provide leverage against the KGB.
But this strategy contained a fatal structural flaw. The CIA equated a history of Nazism with an unbreakable commitment to anti-communism.
They believed the malware they were installing hated the Soviets, and the KGB exploited that exact blind spot.
Which led directly to the catastrophic case of Heinz Felf.
The ultimate manifestation of this systemic failure.
Felf was a former SS Standartenführer, absorbed into the Gehlen Organization, which evolved into West Germany's BND.
And because of his SS pedigree, his handlers implicitly trusted his anti-communist credentials. He was promoted to the head of counterespionage.
His entire mandate was to locate and neutralize Soviet spies. But Felf was actually a highly effective KGB double agent.
The operational damage is almost incalculable, operating from the absolute center of Western intelligence for a decade.
He transmitted an estimated 15,000 highly classified documents directly to Moscow.
He compromised the identities of at least 100 CIA and BND operatives. He basically neutralized the West's entire network behind the Iron Curtain.
The CIA's strategy of amoral pragmatism didn't just fail, it actively facilitated their own destruction.
They literally funded and protected the most devastating Soviet spy ring of the early Cold War.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it proves that when an intelligence apparatus abandons its foundational principles for immediate utility, it loses the ability to accurately assess risk.
But it wasn't just analysts stealing documents. The realpolitik extended to actively adopting the enemy's methodologies. Let's talk about Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon.
The Gestapo chief in Lyon, France. His history is the systematic torture and murder of thousands of French resistance members and the deportation of Jewish children.
After the war, the French government, a vital American ally, indicts Barbie and demands his immediate extradition to face the guillotine.
But U.S. military intelligence had already recruited Barbie for his localized anti-communist network.
So what does the U.S. do? They initiate a policy of active deception against their own ally.
They hide Barbie from French intelligence, issue false statements about his whereabouts.
And when the pressure gets too high, they don't surrender him. They use the exact same ratline infrastructure Skorzeny helped build to smuggle Barbie out of Europe and into Bolivia.
They deployed U.S. government resources to ensure a mass murderer escapes the justice system of an allied democracy.
And Barbie spends decades in South America instructing military dictatorships on the brutal interrogation techniques he perfected in the Gestapo.
The United States effectively acted as a conduit, exporting Nazi torture methodologies. And they actively utilized them in their own operations, too.
Which brings us to Camp King, a U.S. military intelligence black site in Oberursel, Germany.
It was a specialized interrogation center for captured Soviet operatives.
But instead of using American interrogators, the U.S. military systematically placed former Gestapo and SS interrogators on the payroll.
They rehired the Gestapo to run an American prison because they assessed that these extreme, inhuman methodologies were more effective at breaking Soviet psychology.
It's the moment where the distinction between liberator and conquered completely collapses. The justification was always the greater good of the Cold War, but the reality was the U.S. military validating the darkest methodologies of the Third Reich.
And this systemic blindness wasn't contained to intelligence. It metastasized into the scientific establishment, Operation Paperclip.
The recruitment of German scientists for American aerospace dominance. Everyone talks about Werner von Braun, but Arthur Rudolph reveals the true depth of the complicity.
Arthur Rudolph was the chief operations director of the Middlework facility,
An underground manufacturing complex for the V-2 ballistic missile, powered entirely by a slave labor force from the Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp.
Under his direct supervision, an estimated 20,000 prisoners were systematically worked, starved, or beaten to death.
And this wasn't a secret. The U.S. military had the records. But his expertise in rocket engines was deemed absolutely critical.
So they scrub his personnel files, sanitize his history of war crimes, and integrate him into the highest levels of NASA.
He wasn't just an advisor. Arthur Rudolph is appointed as the project manager for the Saturn V rocket program.
The vehicle that carried Apollo 11 to the moon.
The ultimate symbol of American ingenuity is managed by a man whose previous project consumed 20,000 slaves. NASA even gave him the Exceptional Service Medal.
He lived a life of immense prestige until 1984, when he finally fled to West Germany to avoid prosecution.
When you look closely at the Saturn V or the intelligence networks that map the Soviet Union, you realize they're structurally dependent on the expertise of men who orchestrated the darkest chapters of the 20th century. So, what does this all mean?
This raises an important question about the DNA of these agencies.
Right. Does the West fundamentally sacrifice the moral high ground the moment the war ends?
The operational justification was always that the immediate existential threat required the suspension of conventional ethics. They thought they were operating in a vacuum.
But the methodology becomes the institution.
Exactly. When you hide a war criminal or put a Gestapo torturer back in an interrogation room, you are actively validating fascism. You establish a precedent that human rights are entirely conditional.
We have journeyed from the meticulous aerodynamics of a glider assault to the chemical dissolution of a scientist in a German forest. We've seen an agency born from the Holocaust manipulate a Nazi hunter to optimize an SS commando.
We've dissected the CIA funding a Soviet spy ring and the U.S. exporting Gestapo torture while building the path to the stars over the bones of Middlework.
The historical record thoroughly dismantles the sanitized good versus evil narratives of the Cold War. It forces a deeply critical examination of our modern geopolitical structures.
Because the institutional memory of the intelligence community is deep. That philosophy of ultimate pragmatism was hard-coded into these agencies during this exact period.
So when you read the news today about proxy wars, private military contractors, or alliances of convenience, remember this baseline. If Western democracies in Israel could literally recruit the architects of the Holocaust just moments after the war, ask yourself, what lines are they willing to cross today in the name of national security?
It really requires you to question whether systemic flaws in global statecraft are anomalies, or just the intended results of a machine built by men who believe survival justifies any mechanism.
Think about the fact that the institutions governing our modern geopolitical safety and the rockets that took humanity to the stars are inextricably linked to the protection of the 20th century's worst criminals. How much of the modern civilized world you live in today was quite literally built on bargains with the devil?